Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. There are still spaces here, so please feel free to come here. Okay, my name is Chelsea Zhou. I'm the director of the Hoover Center for East Asian Democratic Studies. It is my great pleasure here today to welcome you to the Master Lecture on Global Political Economy. This is an event that is of a series, and it is hosted by the College of Social Sciences at National Taiwan University. And its co-hosts includes my center, the Hoover Center, and the Taiwan Social Resilience Research Center, and the Georgetown Alumni Club of Taiwan. Today, I also wanted to have my special thanks to our Dean, Zhang Youzong, for his generous support, and also Professor Jason Guo, who is the Associate Dean for International Affairs, and all the other staff that is very helpful in involving the preparation and organization of this event. And also grateful for all of you who are in the audience to come to hear this important lecture today. We are honored to have with us Professor Abraham Newman, a leading scholar in international political economy and global governance today. Dr. Newman received his PhD in political science from the University of California in Berkeley. He is currently a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government. He's also the director of the university's BMW Center for German and European Studies. I was actually wondering if you drive BMW or American cars, and we can talk about this later. He is the author of Privacy and Power, and most recently, The Underground Empire, whose Chinese version has just been released. Now we are very glad to have this version because this really helps us to have a more comprehensive of those critical thinking. So as early as 2019, Professor Newman and his co-author, Dr. Henry Farrell, introduced the very important concept of weaponized interdependence in the prestigious academic journal International Security. The book is very important in the sense that it brings back the concept of great power politics in Americans' mainstream research on international political economy. This influential concept has received numerous praises, including from Nobel laureate Professor Paul Krugman. And this concept, I believe, has already have a significant impact on U.S. foreign policy, economic policy since the first Trump administration. So today, Professor Newman is going to speak on a very timely, important, and pressing topic that is economic security under Trump 2.0. And without further ado, please join me welcoming Professor Newman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind introductions. I wanted to also thank the Dean and Jason for hosting me here today. I've got 4 goals for this talk. First, I want to just convey the core argument of the book. I want to kind of show how it has transformed relations between the US and adversaries, allies, and the companies that are being weaponized. The third goal is I want to talk about Trump and how he has transformed these tools in the last 2 months. And then I want to offer some kind of paths forward. How should we think about managing a world where economic interactions create vulnerabilities as well as opportunity? So the core of my research is really to understand how global economic networks have transformed politics globally. And it's hard to realize, but many of our day-to-day interactions are new. global networks for communication. If you think about that technology in your pocket that you Twitter, if you can't find, it's only been around for under 20 years. Google, similarly. These things are not just part of our history, they're new. Similarly, production networks, so the ones that TSMC is a part of, they're new. For many decades, innovation systems were national. Production was national. Now it's global. And if you think about finance, we had capital controls for most of the global economy through the 1970s. So whether it's communication, finance, production, the global nature of these networks is a relatively new thing. And we don't really understand how it affects politics. So there was a standard story somewhere in your brain. You have this image of what do these networks do? How does politics work in a world of globalization? And there's an author, Thomas Friedman. He had a book, he called it The World is Flat. And that flat world, it described a picture of global politics, which was about how companies would be in charge and great power conflict was going to be muted. Okay, we were going to be done with great power rivalry. And so he wrote an article in 1999 where he said, we live in the world of the web and not the wall. And the wall he was talking about was the Berlin Wall. And his argument was the age of US-Soviet rivalry was over, and we are now in a place where it's all about these networks, and they're going to drive wealth and peace. And he was talking about this really new technology, the World Wide Web, which at this time that sounded very, technologically cutting edge. We don't talk about it as the World Wide Web anymore, but he used this image of a web to talk about how economic networks would decenter power. They would prevent that concentration of power. Okay. Unfortunately, if you've been alive for the last 5 years, this is not the world we live in, okay? And it's not just because of the man in the top corner. Whether we think about sanctions against Russia, whether we think about interactions between the US and China in the Biden administration over semiconductors, or even the relations between other countries like Japan and South Korea. These types of tools, economic coercion, have been used increasingly by actors across the globe in order to exert their political interests. So how do we understand that? What is this world? How does it function? And how, if you're a citizen in this world, how should you prepare yourself to manage it? So Henry Farrell and I, in writing this book, we have an alternative to the Thomas Friedman world, where we make basically two simple arguments that I think can help you understand this place that we're in a new way. So the first is very banal. It's this map, which if you've ever flown Delta Airlines, you know this map, okay? It is about how the hub and spoke system of Delta works. You will be in Atlanta. Doesn't matter if you're going from Cancun to Caracas, you're going to be in Atlanta. Now that's great if you like Coca-Cola, because in that airport, you can get any flavor of Coca-Cola you can imagine. It's very cool. There's a machine, you can get crazy flavors. But if there's a storm in Atlanta, you're doomed, okay? Because that's going to shut down any connections. And this pattern of concentration of economic activity, it replicates across the global economy. This is like a very not mundane example, but this is where all the action happens. So this product is run by an operating system that is made by one or two companies, Apple or Google. The chip is either TSMC or Samsung. And if you make a financial transaction in the world, it's going to go through just a handful of global banks that process those transactions. And so the first part of the argument is to say the world is not flat. It's actually very hierarchical. It's concentrated. Economic activity is organized around a few key hubs in the global economy. Okay, the second part is what is the consequence of that for politics? And that's a different understanding of the web. Because what sits at the center of a web? It's a predator. The web is not something that decenters power. It concentrates power for the predator to use as it tries to deal with its adversaries. And in our story, that predator are the states, the large, great powers who have control over those private networks. So you could think about the United States, China, the European Union. They're all actors that use that web for one of two purposes: either to surveil their opponents, to understand the activity that is going on in all of those economic channels, or to cut their adversaries out of that web so that they do not have access to those key global markets. Okay? So that's the core argument. It's very simple, just the world is not flat, it's centralized, and that states can use that structure of the international economy in order to target their adversaries by either monitoring, surveilling them, or by cutting them out. Okay? And now I'm going to show you, like, where did this come from and what happens when states use this power, like the United States, on different actors. So I am a comic book geek. I love comic books, and in every superhero story, there is the origin. If you've ever seen any of those million Marvel movies, they begin with the origin story, and it's always tragedy. That's where the superpower gets its superpowers. And in our story, it's the tragedy of September 11th, 2001. And what I want you to understand is that this weaponization of the global economy is not something that is just a Trump phenomena. It started a long time ago. And in our story, it happens where the US government is facing a radically new problem, which is globalization has been turned into a weapon against the United States. The terrorists use networks for communication, for finance, for transport, to target the US government, okay, and the US society. And so you have across the US government agencies thinking, how do we flip this? How do we become actors that can protect the US society? And what I want to stress is that for us, it's not some great plan. It's not like the US government was just waiting to trap its adversaries in that web. It's really, they're just stumbling through. And they often are like in a fog of war. They don't know what's happening, and they discover things. And those discoveries then build. And so the first one that we talk about in the book is this map, okay? This map was one of the slides that was released in the Snowden revelations when a contractor for the NSA, he released a bunch of surveillance programs that were part of the government's effort post 9/11 to deal with the terrorist threat. This program is about the fiber optic cables that connect the world's communication structures with each other. Now, the NSA agent, in addition to loving skiing, because you can see he describes each major choke point as a ski resort, he's identifying the landing sites of those key fiber optic cable ports in the United States. What is so special about fiber optic cables? Because as soon as I say fiber optic cables, I think many people want to go to sleep because they're like, I don't know. But do you know what is the speed at which data travels on a fiber optic cable? Light speed, the speed of light. I feel like I'm in a Star Trek episode. We're going at the speed of light, okay? What is special about the speed of light is that the planet is smaller than the speed of light. So if you can move things at the speed of light, you have an instantaneous data transfer, where if you're on copper wire, you could get lags. You could get things that wouldn't transmit as fast. So if you're in Brazil, it is faster to go from Rio to Miami and then from Miami to Brasilia, rather than within the country, because the fiber optic cables are going to go faster. Because of that, data across the world goes through the United States more than it might go just even within your own country. And that fact allowed the NSA to monitor a lot of the globe's internet traffic. And this is why countries are interested in developing their own submarine cables or fiber optic cables, because they're trying to restructure this issue that was made present by the Snowden revelations. What I just want to underscore is this is just one example of how economic activity is often centralized, and that lets states use it for their political objectives. So in the middle part of the book, we talk about how these processes of surveilling and cutting actors out of the international system, they ratchet up in a process that is not always thought through, but it is where actors are in a crisis, terrorism, in a crisis, non-proliferation, in a crisis, sovereign invasion, okay? The government officials take what was first they thought as the ceiling, like you would never do this, and then that becomes the floor. And then they do something that's much, much bigger. So after the terrorist attack, the US government used the SWIFT organization. It's like a encrypted email system for banks. It started to use that to monitor terrorists. Then it cut Iran off from this system in the negotiation over nuclear weapons. But in the most recent Russia sanctions, we went way past SWIFT. The European Union froze 300 billion central bank reserves not through the SWIFT system, but through the euro clearing system. So what I want you just to see is that these economic tools of coercion, they build on each other in a kind of an escalation ladder, and it's often hard to unwind them. Okay. In the second part of the talk, I want to talk about how using these tools is leading to interactions between different actors, adversaries, allies, and intermediaries. And I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but I'm happy in the Q&A to talk more. So the first is with China. And in this part of the book, we talk about the confrontation over the telecommunications company Huawei. And in particular, the US is worried that as China develops the next generation of cell phones, that they will be able to do to the US and its allies what the US did under Snowden, that 5G systems will be provided by Huawei, and that they will then surveil what the US is doing. The US doesn't have a provider for this technology. We don't have a company that does that. And so the US government has to get creative about how can they deal with this problem. And they turn to two different other economic networks in order to box in Huawei and its global ambitions. And I'm going to just briefly talk about these two different strategies that the US government does. So on the top corner is the COO of Huawei. She was flying from China to Mexico via Vancouver. And when she arrives in Vancouver, a bunch of Canadian Mounties come and arrest her. And I like to imagine that they were on horses with their fun hats, like the Canadian Mounties. I don't think they really were. But either way, why? What is going on? How is it that the Canadians arrest her while she's transiting? So this is where the US uses the financial network, okay, the global financial network, in order to advance their case against Huawei. And in particular, there's a bank, HSBC, which is the bank of Huawei. And that bank, many years ago, had got in trouble with the US government, and the US government had a legal agreement, it's called a deferred prosecution agreement, where the bank agreed to give data about illegal activity to the US government. And they start to feed the US government information that Huawei had been breaching the Iran sanctions. And so the US has an extradition agreement with Canada. Canada arrests Meng, and she's then in house arrest for multiple years. Now, don't get too worried. She has 2 mansions in Vancouver, so she was just in her mansion. But still, for the company, this is a huge blow to its reputation through this centralized economic network. The other graph, which you don't need to read, but it's a different network that the US government uses. Here they use the network of intellectual property that the semiconductor system relies on. And they created something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which is another one of those things that kind of makes you go to sleep. But what it means is, is if you're any company in the world and you use US intellectual property to make your good, like TSMC, you can't sell that good to Huawei. And it's extraterritorializing intellectual property in order to constrict Huawei's access to those systems. Okay? So here's a case where the US doesn't have a telecommunications network that it can use, but it uses these other networks in order to constrain China. The second group I want to talk about are the allies. So not the countries that the US is directly worried about surveilling them or cutting them out, but those that we often work together with. And the European Union is a very interesting case because it's like the definition of the old world is flat order. Okay, the European Union believes so deeply in the World Trade Organization, its whole DNA is built around openness. And so when Trump starts to use these types of economic coercion against Europe, against Iran, Europe realizes it can't respond. And then very quickly you have the Russia invasion, and Europe transforms itself and works with the United States, with the Biden administration, to sanction Russia. And what I want you to see is how this transformation of the global economy from the world is flat to the weaponized interdependence is really altering how governments deal with day-to-day problems. And of course, the culmination of that for Europe is sanctioning Russia and freezing its central bank reserves. So if anybody tells you that, oh, Europe is not part of this transformation, go ask Beijing what they thought about this moment when the central bank reserves of Russia get frozen. Okay, the final group that I want to talk about is the intermediaries, the companies that are the foot soldiers of this new world. And in the book, we talk about different strategies that these companies try to pursue to protect themselves. And in one part, we talk about TSMC, and here it's a company whose whole business model is about being neutral, is about not picking sides, about working with anybody, okay? It's about being a trusted provider of production for some of the most advanced technologies in the world. And all of a sudden, they're being asked to pick sides, to restrict the use of their technology for some countries versus others. And this, I think, was something that, in my view, the company was not really prepared for. We start this section of the book, there's a LinkedIn ad that TSMC posts just a few years ago saying, we're looking for somebody with geoeconomic experience. And I would say that was maybe a few years too late for this set of problems. And I think this isn't resolved. The other strategy is Microsoft. Microsoft also tried to stay neutral, but then during the Ukraine war, they did something very different. They picked sides. They picked Ukraine's side, and they demonstrated their awesome capability to intervene in a war. They basically lifted the Ukrainian government's information into the cloud so that if the government had fallen, that all that information would be saved for a government in exile. And that is like a capacity that we've never seen before, that kind of intervention by a company to protect a government. And if there are these crazy corporate videos that Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, gives, where I don't know if people know the movie Stormship Troopers, where the company is going to save the civilian and the enterprise. And the enterprise in this case is the firm. And I think it's really a case where the company is using this as a marketing exercise to show what it can do. The final group are companies that are saying they're going to go beyond this world. They're not going to be part of any type of coercion. And you often hear this as crypto companies, crypto firms. And what we argue in the book is that it's very difficult for these companies to escape the hands of the underground empire. Because ultimately, if you're really decentralized, you can't make any money. And so what happens is a company comes along and they put a layer over that decentralized system. And in this case, Binance is a good example of that. And once you centralize that economic activity, the government knocks. And if you followed what happened to Binance, they were engaged in a set of fraud activities. The government prosecuted them, and they signed a deferred prosecution agreement. And so they basically become then a window into the world of crypto, giving information to the US government. Okay. The next part, which I think is probably what people are most interested in, dun, 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 is what is happening? What is this world that we've now entered? And if you have one thing that you take away from this conversation, is that it's not just economics, it's political. And I think that there's been too many analyses of Trump's tariffs that start from the premise that it's about manufacturing or creating more jobs. That, I think, is the wrong frame to understand what's happening. It's much more a political move that I think has three components. So the first is just a domestic political issue, and that is that the Trump administration would like to transform the tax system in the United States. And in order to do that, they have to demonstrate that they have money coming in to clear a legislative procedural hurdle. Okay, there's something called the parliamentarian of the Senate, and for them to pass a law that's based on 50 votes, they have to show that it can be funded. And so the tariffs provide a political expedient way to get that through. And then they will move the US system from an income tax, where it is a progressive system that taxes the high income earners more, to tariff-based taxes, which will be more like a consumption tax, okay? So this has nothing to do with Taiwan, it has nothing to do with jobs, it is just a political argument about how can they get those tax cuts through. The second point is that the Trump administration does not want to be constrained by international rules, like the liberal rules-based international order. And this tariff policy shatters that old order. It calls into question things like the WTO. It basically says we are not working through multilateral systems in order to deal with economic interaction. And why do they want to do that? It's because those rules constrain the Trump administration's objectives, its political objectives. Okay? It's going to cause a recession in the United States. It's not about like economic logic, it's about political power and how you maximize that. And the third part is really about negotiating dynamics between the United States and other countries, which is that by imposing tariffs unilaterally across the world, it resets the bargaining dynamic. Every country has to come to try to get a deal with the United States. And that creates a dominance relationship between the president and those countries where he and his kind of insiders, they can ask for concessions from the countries. Now, it might not produce manufacturing, it might not help the US economy, but it helps that core group of people have power vis-a-vis other actors, okay? And what I want to stress is that this is not like a loyalty test type of relationship where you show you're loyal to the US and then you don't get asked for anything else. It's a dominance test, which means that if you give in, you will likely be asked for more. And so it's a very, it's a precarious position if you're the other side of the negotiation. Okay, in the final part of the talk, I just want to talk about the consequences and how we prevent the worst things from happening. So the first is just firms have to understand they're in a new world of political risk. This is not the world where your investments are nationalized by developing countries. This is a world where the channels of globalization, production, communication, finance, are being turned into a vulnerability. And this is like a apocalypse epochal, a very large change in how the international system works for companies that thought globalization worked one way, and now it exposes them to a new risk. Henry Farrell and I have a new piece in Foreign Affairs where we talk about this in the context of the tech sector, about how companies like Google or Apple, if they get too close to the Trump administration, they could risk their reputation in the global market. The second part is that I am very concerned about fragmentation, that you will get a splitting of the global economy into basically blocks. And of course, everybody thinks about like a China block and a US block, but I think you could imagine a world where tariffs against China lead China to dump production into the world economy. And so then countries like Japan and Europe, they raise tariffs, and you get a spiraling of tariffs where it's not just two blocks, but it's really a very fragmented global order, one that would make us all poorer. And the final point, this book by Nick Mulder, what he thinks about is past examples of economic coercion, and his lesson is that the response doesn't have to stay economic. It can also become militarized. It can become kinetic. Countries that feel encircled will or could use military ends to resolve this type of interaction. And in this case, he talks about Japan in the run-up to World War II, where economic coercion accelerated the militarization of the Japanese plans in the Pacific. Okay, so what can we do? The first, I blame myself. It's always good to prostrate yourself, at the beginning and just say, we have to train people to think about economic and security issues together. In my school, where we train like the future leaders of policymaking, we have separate tracks often for economic and security relations, and those have to be merged. We don't have the convenience of thinking that those are distinct. And it's not just about schools, it's about businesses. Businesses have to have people that work on economic security embedded in them, and governments do as well. And so we need to have training programs, leadership tracks that think about how to bring these two issues together. The second is building the institutions to respond to these types of problems. I was just in Japan for 2 weeks, and they have like a model law about economic security. And they have a cabinet office that's based on economic security, and they have a set of institutions in their bureaucracies that coordinate responses to these issues. In the United States, we don't have nearly anything like this. And so we need to have domestically a set of institutions, but you also need to think about regionally. How do countries like Australia, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, how do they coordinate together in their response if they're the object of coercion by China or the United States? They have to be able to have an institutional capability to coordinate together. I have 2 more points. And this one is basically, we don't have a language yet to talk about how to constrain the worst forms of economic coercion. It's like the moment when nuclear weapons are created, where it didn't come with a rule book. There wasn't mutually assured destruction. That wasn't something that people knew or understood. People like us, we had to come up with that language, okay? A set of principles, norms, rules around when is it appropriate and not appropriate to use these tools, and we need that similar language today about economic coercion. The final point I want to make is just the importance of not just focusing on the sticks. It's easy when somebody uses economic coercion that you think, well, we need to strike back. But often the best response is the carrots. So in my trip in Japan, and I would also say that here, is rather than thinking about retaliation, it's how do you deepen your diversification of economic exchange with other countries. So I would think deepening, for example, the CPTPP is one avenue that that Taiwan could pursue, or Japan or Australia, in order to create a world where there's still advantages to openness and not closure. Okay, so let me just summarize the key points. The first is that the global economic networks that we created, just in the last 30 years, they are not just sites of opportunity, they're also sites of vulnerability. The second is that policymakers are not using them in some systematic way where they have we often from the outside, we think the US government is like this awesome machine that knows exactly what it's doing. But when you open it up, it's like a few people pulling levers that are like drinking Diet Coke all day and struggling to stay awake, and they're not doing it in any rational, organized way. It's a much more in the fog of war kind of movie. And so that's not good because it's likely to create miscalculations or unanticipated consequences. And then the final point is that we need to build a system, the language, the institutions, and rules to prevent these types of economic coercion from getting out of control. And if we don't, globalization could be threatened. Not just a little tariff, 10% tariff, but much broader sense of open economic markets. And if that happens, we would all be poorer and worse off. And so I think we all have to work very hard to push back against the unconstrained use of these types of tools. And with that, I thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's very thought-provoking and timely important. So we still have like 30 minutes, I think, or 20 to 30 minutes. So I guess I would like to open up the Q&A session. So just any questions are welcome, but before that, please identify yourself, your title, your name, and your institution. Okay? Yeah, we have one, Professor Wei Meijuan, J.C. Wei Meijuan. Yeah. Yeah, can you stand up, please? Can you? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Meijuan Wei from Graduate Institute of Development Studies of National Zhenjiang University. I've got two questions. The first one is, what do you think about the response of Beijing to Trump's decision to raise its tariff on China from 145% to 245%, right? And Beijing has announced that it would kind of put this issue forward to the Security Council of United Nations, accusing the United States or Trump of weaponizing tariff. So I would like to know how you think about this. And another one is about Taiwan, because you mentioned the negotiations actually is a dominance test, right? And I would like to know how do you think about what Taiwan should do in order not to be over or further dominated by the United States. Thank you.
Maybe we collect like 3 questions and then you ask the speaker to respond. Okay, yeah, please.
Hi, Professor Newman. My name is Walter Liu. I'm a reporter on technology for Business Today, a major business publication in Taiwan. I have 2 questions. First, what's your recommendations or suggestions for Taiwanese companies working on manufacturing electronics? I think TSMC is not the only example. We also have other noted companies that have a large share of American business like Foxconn or MediaTek. I know all these 3 companies, they have their own lobby team in DC, but there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of Taiwanese tech companies that mainly focus on outsourced manufacturing in Taiwan. And America market is one of the major area of focus. So for these numerous Taiwanese tech companies working on manufacturing, if they want to prepare themselves better for lobby or legal research or government relations in America, what can they do? Because not everyone like TSMC can hire a former Intel PR guy to head their DC office. So what's your recommendation? And second, I think you just mentioned a little bit about what the education organization can do. So again, for Taiwan, if in postgraduate or maybe undergraduate departments here, in the past we mainly focus on politics, economics, or maybe business schools. So is there any combined track or maybe a new kind of departments that we can come up with to respond to the ever-changing this environment? Thank you.
Great. So I think it'll be very difficult for international organizations to resolve this conflict, both because the U.S. often has a blocking position in those kinds of relationships, and also because I think the Trump administration is not that interested in international organizations, and so I think they're willing to accept, that international organizations might not agree with their policy. But I think the bigger issue is that there's kind of a game of chicken happening between China and the United States, where neither party is really willing to back down, and they're both willing to escalate. And that's why I'm worried that the consequence will hit third countries. So if there is a lot of trade friction between the two parties, China's response could be to dump their extra goods on countries like the European Union or Japan, which would then cause those countries to respond with their own tariffs. And so I think it's very important for trading countries, I would call them like an openness alliance, Japan, Australia, the European Union, to be prepared for that moment and to really coordinate their response in a way that it doesn't escalate in this way. I think that's more important than I think China and the US, it's a chicken game, and one of them will back down, and it's just the question of who's willing to tolerate the pain longer. And I have my own bets on that, but I think it's really about the other countries. They should be focused on how to prevent a financial crisis spurring in other countries. On what Taiwan could do, I think the most savvy game would be just to be patient. Nobody likes to hear that. Everybody wants to have action, but my sense is that the 90 days is really a bluff. The government has already shown it's not capable of sustaining the high-level tariffs because the bond market basically said that they would collapse the government's debt position. So I think Trump has already signaled his unwillingness to face that crisis, which means that we're likely to be in a position where we are right now for a country like Taiwan, not China. I think China is a different game, but for a country like Taiwan, it's to its advantage to be patient, and I think to learn something maybe from the Japanese, which is to kind of hide in plain sight, to make offers of things that are not that costly, that does not show like a willingness to just be dominated over and again. I think the other strategy that Taiwan should pursue is to deepen openness with other countries, is to divert its trade dependence so that it is less at risk. The final thing that this, I think, is important to remember, which is often countries see themselves as independent targets of the tariffs, but everybody is being tariffed. So the relative impact on a firm is much less. If you make, let's say, mango, the Philippines is also being tariffed at 10%. And so the relative competitive disadvantage is really for the US consumer, who has to pay more for mangoes, but not really the Taiwan versus the Philippines. And so if you think about the global impact of these tariffs, there's not that much leverage that the US gets out of them. It's only the fear, and that's why I think Trump is using the tariffs, is because they grab headlines. They are things that dominate the news cycle, 90 days extension, those kinds of things that everybody's watching what will happen. But if you step back, I think just be patient, think about how to get exemptions. That's what I think the semiconductor industry did a good job at, of working with U.S. firms in order to get exemptions for core export markets, and wait for other people to take the bait. For companies, I think the key is really to think about, rather than some deal that will solve this problem, because as I said, I don't think that there's any deal that will solve the problem. I think it's also important just to stress, the US started negotiations with 190 countries simultaneously, okay? It basically said, all of you will be tariffed, now you need to come to negotiate. But there are not 190 plans about what the US government wants. And in fact, I don't think there are really very many plans. I think it's very ambiguous. And so at the same time, the US government has been gutting the technical expertise to create those plans by firing many government workers. And so if you're a company that is facing an issue, then I would work with US colleagues in your export markets in order for them to be advocates for your interests, because I don't think traditional diplomacy is really going to be the solution to these kinds of interactions. I think it's going to be much more business to business interactions that then will work up the political chain to the Trump administration about what are the consequences of this policy for US companies and US actors, and that will, I think, be the most effective channel. The final point about training, I think that this is a really important question. There was a government track, it was called the PMF Fellowship. It was the Presidential Management Fellows. It was a way to create priorities for the US government, and I was advocating that they should create an economic security fellowship. Right now, the Trump administration has really gotten rid of all those efforts, which I think is to their own, it will only harm their ability to coordinate these efforts. But I would encourage other governments to do that kind of a thing, and I think firms should also create that kind of a system. I have started teaching a class on global economic security. That's something that's very new. I don't think very many universities have that. So I think it has to happen, the education has to happen at every level.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Dr. Newman, my name is Joshua, and I'm a research assistant from Academia Sinica. So I have two questions and asking for my friend. And the first question is that, what's your opinion about the U.S. weaponized interdependence measures that mostly is a short-term impact? Because as we know of the recent years, those America's WI has it seems like impact like China or any other authoritarian countries, like it really is a short effect instead of the long-term one. So what do you think about is there the so-called the long-term impact weaponized interdependence policy? And the second one is that, as Fryman said, as you said, the world is a web, but there's a lot of cases let's say economic sanctions web or any other webs. Mostly we talk about how the web works instead of is the web strong enough to let the predator to catch its prey, or is it strong enough to defend from the big raindrop that will have a potential to destroy the web? So these are kind of metaphorical questions, but is there any opinion for Dr. Newman?
Great. So I think that there's a big debate about will these economic coercion, the tools, can they persist over time? And I think it really depends on the network and whether you can substitute it or not. So I'll just give you two different examples. In finance, it's very difficult to substitute the dollar clearing system that is used for sanctions. And when the Obama administration started to weaponize the network for finance, Secretary Treasury Liu, he gave several speeches where he was warning about overuse of these tools because he was worried that people would circumvent the tools, the system. But honestly, it didn't happen. And when Trump used these tools more, people kept using the dollar. And often, people's use of the dollar even went up. And so the Biden administration, their lesson was, I can keep using these tools and that they will not actually run out. I think there's a different question, which is, do they work? Do they get the objective that you want? And I would just be realistic. Most foreign policy tools don't work, okay? How many arms do we send to countries about wars? Do they stop the wars? Very rarely. So what is the objective? Why are they doing that? It's often these tools are to create transaction costs for the target that bog them down. So I think like in the Russia sanctions, no, they didn't stop the war, but they have inflicted huge economic burden on Russia. And if you didn't have those sanctions, Russia would have had more resources for the war. Similarly, with the China export controls, China's still going to work to develop their own chips, but the Biden administration's assessment is it slowed them down from AI dominance. You can debate it, but that's their goal. That was what they were trying to achieve. Flip that to 5G systems. The more the US puts pressure, there is an alternative. Huawei has an alternative. There is a substitute. So there you could imagine flipping more quickly from one set of networks to another. And that's the question of whether countries will open themselves up to Huawei. And I think many countries are skeptical because they know that the company could be a channel for the Chinese government to get data on them. So I think, it's like there's risks as well as opportunities. Will these webs be strong enough? I think that's kind of a similar question. Will they just evolve? And in the book, in the conclusion, our argument is the biggest threat to weaponized interdependence is about democracy in the United States. It's not about so much what China does or other countries. It's about, do people have faith in private companies in the United States, that they're still private companies? Because that's the channel that these powers work through. If you just see Starlink as a part of the US government and not a private company, then you start to be concerned, is this, can I depend on my contract that it will be carried out? Or is it just something that's at the whim of the US government? And so we argue at the end of this book, which came out before this Trump administration, the real threat to US economic coercion, its tools, is the demise of democracy and property rights in the United States.
Question? Okay, please. Here, stand up. Stand up. On the microphone.
Thank you for your wonderful speech. My name is Wei Chen Ling from Department of Political Science at National Taiwan University. I want to ask a question about your international security article. You introduced the concept of panopticon and choke point effect to explain how the United States weaponized economic interdependence. So I would like to ask a follow-up question. As we can see that China has tried to leverage its rare earth exports during the US-China trade conflicts. And also Taiwan manufactures over than 80% of the world's advanced semiconductor. Yet, both of Taiwan and China seem unable to exert influence in the same way as the United States does. So I would like to ask, to what extent can the theory of weaponized interdependence be applied to other countries? Or under what conditions do states other than the United States gain the capacity to weaponize interdependence? Thank you for your speech. Thank you.
So one of the key things is that there are a lot of different ways to exert economic coercion If you think the case of rare earth metals is it's a bilateral dependence. It's kind of a very traditional form of economic coercion where you sell something, other people want that thing, and you say, I'm not going to sell it to you. And it's an embargo. And the problem, there's two problems. One is that it incentivizes people to diversify. And in the case of rare earth metals, there's nothing actually that rare about rare earth metals. It's just they're very gross to produce. They have a lot of environmental harm to the labor, to the workers that do it. And so countries like the United States outsource that to China because of environmental laws in the United States. But it is possible for the United States to produce rare earth metals, and China's action will incentivize that. And that is what happened when China did that to Japan, is it created that same kind of response. It also means that China has to forego the money that it sells through these interactions. And that's where, if you look at Chinese interactions with Australia, that often China eventually backs down because they need the coal, aluminum, whatever those things are, and if they're using that as coercion, it's quite difficult. In weaponized interdependence, it's a network where the intermediary is often a foreign firm. So it doesn't cost the United States that much to force Deutsche Bank to stop banking Iran. That it forces the cost onto Deutsche Bank rather than the U.S. market. And so in that way, you're able to use it for longer. And that's also why the tariffs are much more difficult to maintain, because they're that other type of economic coercion. They are the one where it hurts the U.S. economy just as much as it hurts the other player. And so that's why I think, it will be very difficult for the United States to go back to that original proposed tariff policy.
Okay, so I guess we only have time for one question, but you raise your hand first, so please.
Hello, my name is Kwan, and I'm a software engineer working in Taipei. And I just had one quick question. So I was wondering what you think, if Trump actually gets what he wants and creates this new dominance structure that you mentioned earlier with these other countries, do you think the policy positions that he's pursuing right now are actually going to be favorable to future presidents, or do you think these policy positions will simply just go away after 4 years? Just wanted to know your thoughts.
So this is the what's special about Trump question, which I think is very important. And I think that there are elements that are not about Trump. So the United States has been moving towards using unilateral tools of coercion since 9/11. And they have been ramping up those unilateral tools of coercion for decades. And that, I think, will persist whether or not Trump is president or not. I also think other countries are also doing that as well. China has been doing that in a series of events against countries for the last several decades. So it's not just a US phenomenon. The part that I think is unique to Trump, or let me just say one other thing, the US government has also become more and more skeptical of the WTO process and the rules-based liberal order, also for several decades. It predates Trump and other, Biden, he kept the tariffs on China after, Trump left office. So I think there's a persistent skepticism towards that structure to solve the problem. But I do think honestly, the use of tariffs is actually a much more difficult tool to maintain than sanctions, export controls, those other things, which have fewer costs for the U.S. economy. And I also think the short-term bargaining dynamic is really very Trump-specific, that he wants to be in these negotiations where he's at the center and the countries have to come and ask for, what they can do. And it creates also an economic system where they have to kind of tithe, they have to, offer some economic win to his insider group. And I don't think that that's a key structure of the Republican Party. I think that's a very unique Trump ecosystem.
Okay, I think we are approaching the end, but before that, we have a book signing session. So if you have the book with you, please have it ready. But before that, let's give Professor Newman another round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I think today's event is over, and if you have the book to be signed by Professor Abraham Newman, and please line up to the stage, and then he will sign the book that you bring with you. Okay, thank you so much for attending today's event. Thank you so much.
Professor, these are the times for you.
Perfect. I saw.